Hello and welcome to Evangelical 360. I'm your host, Brian Stiller, and I'm pleased to share with you another conversation with leaders, change makers, and influencers impacting Christian life around the world. Please listen in and join the conversation on YouTube in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe and share this episode, and please use hashtag Evangelical360. My guest today is the Reverend Dr. Ray Aldred, Director of Indigenous Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology. The story of Christianity in North America, as in many other countries, is about those who arrived from elsewhere, who claim land as their right, and then we see the consequences those claims create. Over the last century in Canada, one of the most heart-wrenching realities of our history is that of Indigenous children who were forcibly placed in residential schools overseen by Catholic and Protestant churches. I'm grateful for Indigenous leaders, theologians and friends such as Ray Aldred, who are willing to speak and share about the history of this land, its original people, and their relationship with the church, and what it means with the gospel today. Ray Aldred, thank you for joining us on Evangelical 360.
Hey, it's great to see you, Brian. It's good to be here.
Yeah, Ray, our hearts break when we hear stories of children being rooted out of families and home. And yet we can't stop. We've got to move on with faith and love. And I guess the question to ask about the Indigenous community is there hope today?
I think there's always been hope among Indigenous people. I mean, that's why Indigenous people keep asking for reconciliation. They're the ones who call for reconciliation. I'm in Regina today, and I remember listening to elders say, Indigenous people are the most forgiving people in Canada. No matter what's happened, they continue to, call on the rest of Canada to be reconciled, to, heal the land, to heal relationships. So I always find Indigenous people hopeful.
You have worked your way through this story, of course, from your childhood, being of your own ancestry, and you have lived within the Evangelical Church. You now teach at the Vancouver School of Theology. You have wandered down the halls of many institutions, and you've watched denominations and local churches.
Yep.
So if the Indigenous community has hope, are the rest of us ignorant or insensitive or simply uninformed?
I think that maybe popular evangelicalism thinks that I think they think sometimes there's some magic formula that's going to solve something, and somehow tension and sort of difficult situations are somehow going to be gone. And when I read theology and read church history, that's never been the case. I think maybe sometimes with modernity, popular evangelicalism promises something that it can't deliver on. So maybe that's why people feel disillusioned. Lessing Newbigin wrote in a book, Foolishness to the Greeks, the Gospel in Western Culture, that people in Western culture are addicted to happiness. They think that somebody should be able to give them happiness no matter what. And of course, they get disillusioned with God, they get disillusioned with politics, and so they keep looking for this something that's going to make them happy all the time. I think that's why contemporary modern evangelicals sometimes lose hope, because no one can have happy all the time. It's just not going to happen.
Ray, in your family, in your childhood, you're growing up, was there a disruption in your family because you were Indigenous? Were there problems related to growing up or school?
Yeah. My grandmother was an alcoholic. She left my mother. My mother raised her three younger sisters from the time she was about 8 She left because my grandfather was quite abusive in those days. So then I really didn't have a close relationship with my grandmother, although my mom tried to sort of make it better somehow. My uncle was murdered and my cousin died on the downtown east side. All these things when you're a kid, though, growing up, you just think that's how everybody grows up. So you just don't think when you're a kid, you don't know people are being racist to you. You just think that's the way it is. But, people don't rent things to you, or people call you names. You just think that's how it is with everybody. It's only later that you realize that's probably not the way things are supposed to be. But my mom and dad tried hard, but I was thankful that my mom didn't drink and my dad didn't drink much either. But it was in our family, and I was aware of it.
So when you say that evangelicals aren't very good at dealing with trauma, was there trauma in your life that wasn't dealt with?
It's generational trauma. When it happens for generation after generation, and if you grow up feeling ashamed because you're First Nations, the evangelicalism had no answers for that. Popular evangelicalism. Now, once you get into theology, some theologians have some good ideas. And then I actually found guys like Dan Allender, Larry Crabb, that there was some answers there, but they weren't like mainstream or really popular all the time back when I first got into evangelicalism.
Trauma is accumulative. It isn't just personal as first person, but it comes from the past.
Yeah. Well, it can be. See, trauma can be just happen. Someone dies tragically, or, something that can happen. I think last time I looked it up, probably 20% of their general population, that's how trauma impacts. Maybe 20% of the people experience that kind of trauma, like tragic death. So they have a relative who dies tragically or that kind of thing, maybe 20% of society. But for Indigenous people, it's like 80% of us have experienced that. And it impacts you. It affects you. And it's passed on. Because, if your mother learns to deal with trauma by just not feeling and being hard to make it, then that's what gets handed on to you and that's what you learn. So that's kind of what I learned.
At what point in your life did you realize trauma, or whatever else you would call it, was part of your inheritance?
Well, I think that when I moved to Regina, Saskatchewan to do my bachelor's degree, my third year, I started pastoring a First Nations church and listening to people, listening to residential school survivors, and realizing the answers that I have aren't working here. I remember sitting and visiting with someone who was incarcerated for I think they'd been incarcerated probably 40 or 50 times. I don't think I'm exaggerating. Always just maybe a month or two at a time, 30 days. Always not long terms, not a long bit. And I realized when I prayed with the person, I prayed for them to receive Jesus. I remember they opened their eyes, they looked at it, I said, that was good. And he said, I've done that so many times, he said, so many times. And I realized, okay, there's something else going on here. There's something else going on here. That he would keep, get out of jail, something would happen, he'd end up back in jail. Like there's something else going on. And it was trauma. And listening to people's stories and then looking at your own heart, you realize, there's stuff going on. I mean, I came to faith because I was a drug addict and I couldn't quit drinking. And I said, Jesus, if you help me quit using, I'll do whatever you want me to. Well, at the time I said, God. A couple of days later, that's when my brother prayed for me to receive Jesus. I prayed that Jesus would put his spirit in me. And then intuitively, I ended up doing all the things you do in the 12 steps. I had 3 people for the next year. I had 3 people that I could call one of them at any time, 24 hours a day, when I was really struggling. Because when you quit using soft drugs and when you quit drinking, for about 8 months to a year, every day you have this anxiety that pushes you to drink or to use. And I had someone to call. And then the holiness movement, you end up thinking about what's going on. You try to make amends. But it was years later, I was ordained, 1995. And my wife and I, a few years later, maybe 5 years after that, we'd been married about 18 years. We went to marriage encounter, which was good for us. Helped us because we weren't hearing one another much anymore. But it was a couple of years after that, we went to, it was called Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training. And while we were there, I realized there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on inside. Because when you feel ashamed of who you are, what happens is you think you're too bad to receive God's love. You spend most of your Christian life trying to do more religious stuff so God will actually love you. And at some point, a friend of mine said to me, there's something worse than your pain. And I said, what's that? He said, it's your sin. So I remember thinking, what a jerk. Who tells a guy that he feels like, you're feeling all of your pain from your past and you tell him it's your sin? And he said, you believe you're unlovable. And I remember thinking, that's it. That's the thing. I think that a lot of First Nations, I think a lot of people, they think that they're too bad. God couldn't love me. And you actually hold yourself away. So I remember I said, God, give me the gift of repentance. And I began to weep. And it felt like I got born again right there. I said, God, put your love in me. And there was a new freedom that came. I mean, it's like this happened over like a year, maybe years, just thinking about stuff. I remember I told that story to Richard Twist, who you probably remember. And he said, brother, Pentecostal church, we'd say you got the Holy Ghost. And I said, well, I don't know, call it whatever you want. But that was key. And that it's there in places, but that's not what popular evangelicalism was. Like, this was stuff, it was there, but it wasn't popular.
I'm not quite sure I understand, Ray, what wasn't popular, what's not popular, that you would have this experience of, as you prayed for repentance and you felt the love of God fill your life. I mean, that
it's not popular to sit with someone else and talk about what's really going on inside. That wasn't popular. And to talk about the impacts of trauma and to talk about the lies that you have believed about yourself. To look at your heart, that wasn't popular. It's not easy always to find a church where you can be honest about what's going on, or you can be half healed. So that wasn't popular in those days. You had to go someplace else. You had to try to find a courageous space where you could actually do that. That wasn't everywhere. So that's what going further in among my Indigenous people, that's where that led me, because people were trying to deal with stuff like that. That wasn't being dealt with. in popular evangelicalism.
So what was the next step in your life?
Oh, wow. I pastored a church, and then eventually I got into leadership development and started thinking about doing theology, and someone told me I should do a doctorate. So I started bringing together theology and my Indigenous identity and see how they could see one another. Like what was different? What looked different? Now that started when I was doing my master's degree, trying to interpret the Bible through Indigenous eyes. And that was because you could see things, change things, help me discover story, and help me to understand what was going on. That there was more in the Bible than what maybe I had thought before. Well, I remember when I thought I should read this like an Indigenous person instead of trying to read it like an academic scholar. And I saw humor where I hadn't seen humor before. Or I could understand how tribal people were thinking when I thought about how my people function already. And creation, my understanding of creation shifted. And my understanding of who Jesus was and is shifted. Sure. I was reading the story about when the angel comes and says, in a year, you're going to have a child. And Abram's older, and he says, I'm going to call you father of many nations. If you think about it, that's funny. But I couldn't see the humor in it until I started thinking about how we use nicknames among my own people. So people use nicknames because they're teasing you about something. So God shows up, or an angel of the Lord shows up and says to Abram, I'm going to call you father of many nations. And he's too old really to have a baby. He's 99. I just thought that's funny. And then Sarah, then I finally understood Sarah laughs. Like his wife laughs when she hears it too. She laughs because she knows, okay, he's old. This isn't happening. And then suddenly the angel says, don't laugh. And the whole story stood up. I couldn't see that for all that it was, but through my eyes. Or the story when, who is it, comes to Jesus, and Jesus says, here is a true Israelite in whom there is no guile. Yes, that's funny. Because Israel's name is Jacob. Jacob means like trickster, liar. And Jesus says, here is a true Israelite in whom there is no guile. It's funny. It was things like that, but also being able to see how really creation is really central to the gospel. And why John would say all things that came into being through him, like through the word. And it just shifted my thinking about it. Because land was a relative. And then I hadn't understood that. But it was actually reading that. I was reading the genealogy of Jesus, in Luke. And it goes all the way back to Adam. So it starts with Jesus, goes all the way to Adam. And then it says Adam, the Son of God. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, okay, Adam is the Son of God. I don't know if I know what Luke's trying to do. He's trying to set up that Jesus is the new Adam, right? And then I started thinking in my mind. So if Mary's the mother of Jesus, and he's the Son of God, Mary's the mother of Jesus, Jesus is the Son of God. And I'm thinking, Mary's the mother of Jesus. And then I just said, so who's the mother of Adam? And then I just thought, it's the earth. And when I thought that, suddenly I had this feeling about the earth. And I understood why the elders call the earth our mother, for she provides for us. Everything. My dad taught me how to trap. My mom taught me how to snare rabbits. My mom and dad taught me how to fish, how to hunt. And everything that we eat comes from the land. She provides for us. I mean, ultimately, I understand it comes from the Creator, but the earth cares for us. Everything, we get our heat from the earth. We get our clothing from the earth. Everything comes from the earth. She's like our mother. I didn't have any desire to worship the earth, but I felt something for the earth, like a family connection. And I remember thinking, if people could feel that about the land, not that they would worship the earth, but that they could feel something, maybe we could make different decisions when it comes to how we live upon the land or upon the earth, if we understood it was part of the family. And that also helped me to understand the incarnation. For Jesus is fully God, fully human, creator and creation in perfect harmony. And I thought, hey, that's cool. So then that helped me to think about and a whole bunch of other things like restorative justice and sin and how all these things work together. So I owe that all to Indigenous people. Theology gave me some good, they have some good language. It taught me the stories of the Bible. Indigenous people helped me to understand them in ways that I just didn't learn in seminary.
What is that different lens through which they see life, the scriptures, the world around us?
Well, I over the years have tried to think about that. One of them is just that the story happens on the land. It's within creation. That's the only place that we encounter the Creator, is in creation. Like, there's no other place. I don't know, sometimes we talk, sometimes I don't know if people talk and think that there's someplace else they could go, but there isn't. It's in creation. That's where we encounter the Creator. That's the only place. And story, it's always a story, because I heard it from my theology professor, but I think I learned it from Indigenous people. Some truths are so big they can only be contained in a story. So you got to tell the story. And then as we would gather around the story, then it comes to life. Then it, I don't know, I'm taken into the story's taken into me, and somehow there's this thing that's happening. So it's growth. I also am thankful that my parents taught me that, something good happens to your relative, that you should feel good about that. You shouldn't be jealous of them. They're your relative. So it's like it happened to me. So it happened to my brothers. It's like it happened to me. So that communal identity, it was good. And they also taught me the importance of emotion, that emotion was a place you could start and you could learn something from it. Now, Brian, as a Pentecostal, you should understand that part, like the emotion, like emotion's important. But I found Indigenous elders, they didn't discount emotion as a way. It's complicated. You needed a community to understand what was going on, but it was there. So those kind of lenses, through the lens of emotion, through the lens of community, through the lens of the land, and through the lens of story, it's not like those things aren't there in the rest of society, but they just are further back in the memory than they were for Indigenous people. These things were right in the front, so they could teach me about these things. Those are the things that I think about. I had 4 children. That would be a good study, that lots of us who got into trying to bring together Indigenous Christianity and trying to bring together Indigenous and Christian, lots of our kids just walked away. They walked away from the church. I'm not going to say they walked away from Christian faith, but they just didn't want, maybe because they saw their dads and their moms getting such grief. Like, how could you stay? How could you stay? I don't know enough about it to either, but sometimes it seems like our kids take it harder than we did. Well, when different denominations were censoring us or telling us, when we got accused of stuff and told we were, idolatrous, or told we were heretics, or that was all stuff happening when we were trying to bring together Christian faith and being Indigenous. And maybe our kids saw that and just didn't want any part of it. They just kind of walked away. None of my kids are anti-Christian, but I think probably only one of them would, still involved in the church.
Have they walked away from being Indigenous, or have they embraced it?
No. Indigenous is the thing that... So then lots of us, Brian, you remember we met? Lots of us were trying to hold together being Indigenous and being Christian. We were trying to hold this together. I think today, I don't know if young people are actually trying to hold Christianity anymore at all. They're just saying, I want to be Indigenous. No, I don't think that's what we were going for. But sometimes that's what we ended up with.
But being Indigenous, it seems to me, by its very nature, embraces spirituality. But does that spirituality not include the Christian story?
Well, I think it does. And they still might include parts of it. Maybe it's the church they don't like. But that's lots of us, isn't it? I don't know. That's a question I'm trying to work out in my mind. That's why I say it would be an interesting study. Just to go and talk with all these, young people. I talk with my children about it. And they got burned. It wasn't just because they saw me get burned, but they got burned. They got burned in the church. Usually, it was always about people trying to give simple or easy answers to complex questions. So they just said, man, this is... And you run into lots of people like that, I suppose.
Ray, it's been fascinating just to listen to you tell your story. Your story is playing out on a larger landscape here in Canada, and it's true in other countries as well. New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, just place after place. The European settlers that came in and took land, we've gone through various scenarios of trying to find some kind of reconciliation, understanding, reparations even. Here in Canada, we've gone through the Reconciliation Commission, and there's been an enormous amount of conversation. And at the political level, you have various, for example, economic initiatives. Many of them, especially related to energy, can't be done unless Indigenous community is there, participates, and approves. So there's been an awful lot of stuff that's been going on and going on today. On that landscape, as a professor at a major university and as an avowed Christian with your own story of new birth and life in Christ, where is that going for you?
The thing that I work on most is teaching people how to place the gospel in the center. Like, I'm a firm believer in that I think the elders taught us that we need to make sure that we place the gospel in the center. So to gather around, I mean, we do gospel-based discipleship. I do it with my class. And what that involves is we read the gospel, usually from the lectionary, whatever the Eucharistic reading from the lectionary is like. And we read the gospel, and then we say, what are the words, ideas, or phrases that come to mind when you hear that? And then we say, let we read it again. I said, someone else read it in a different translation. And then I say to my students, I say, so what is it? What is the gospel Jesus saying to you? And people share their ideas. And then we read it together a third time in another translation. We say, what is the gospel or Jesus calling you to do? And I try to do that because it's all about the gospel. Now that part evangelicals get right, the church gets right, it's about the gospel. So I try to place the gospel in the center, and then we'll work on the other things together. But I do that with everybody because I don't try to, I do it with people. I don't know if they say they're Christian or not Christian. That's just what I do. That's kind of what I do. So we gather around the gospel, and then we try to, after we do that, we try to tackle the issues that are before us. I mean, I use restorative justice a lot. You got to tell the truth. I think the good thing in Canada, the sign that stuff was changing, like it was a 30-year journey, wasn't it, Brian? It was 30, but Canada, Indigenous people told the truth. Canada started to tell the truth. Churches started to tell the truth, like complete disclosure. Number two, people began to listen with their heart, to really listen, not just to the words being said, but to understand the pain that that people had caused, the pain. And once you feel that, then you have the emotional energy to try to come up with a plan, a shared plan. How do we fix the damage? And I just think that that's where we're at as a society. We're trying to come up with a plan. How do we fix the damage? And I think that's my approach. I think everybody's committed to that, and so I just treat people that way. I try not to spend too much time making people feel bad about what happened. Unless that's what they need, I suppose. But I try to think, okay, so then I just think, look, Canada's guilty. That's an objective fact. That's not a feeling. That's just happened. Okay. So let's move to the next thing. So now how do we heal the damage? How do we heal the damage? And I see different things. Usually it's always in the local church or different people just trying to, heal the damage. And that's why my wife and I spend a lot of time doing stuff with trauma, helping people to strengthen their coping strategies, helping people to grieve in a healthier way, helping people to, see what lies they believe themselves so that then they can sort of, start to understand that Jesus loves them and he likes them. And that's kind of what we do. But you got to go to the hard stuff. And I think that's the thing that evangelicals maybe in the 80s, maybe they were trying to deal with the hard things and they thought if they just, focus on facts or propositional truth, somehow that'll, help. But it doesn't. You got to deal with the hard stuff. You got to go there. Not so you can stay there, but you got to move through it. You got to move through it. And then figure out how you're going to heal it. I don't know. That's a lot of words, Brian, but that's kind of what I try to do. And never forget the gospel.
Ray, it's been just pleasure for me just to listen to you and to hear the words and to feel the rhythms of your heart and to hear between the lines the words. And I was raised in the prairies, as you know, and in the 50s and 40s and 50s. And I look back at our church that simply had no understanding of what had happened as the settlers moved in and land was taken and lifestyle upended and identity cursed. We had no understanding of what was going on. We were blind and deaf. I look back to that and I realize with deep sorrow the failure of my church, my Pentecostal Evangelical church. As honest as they were, as good as they tried to be, as close to the gospel as we attempted to live our lives, we just didn't understand what was going on to the First Nations, Métis, Indigenous. The variety of words come to me as I remember the past. It's a reminder that all of us, both by generation and by individual life, we walk through places, we walk by people, we listen to words, and we don't see and we don't hear. The accumulation, you talk about trauma accumulating out of your past. I think the failure of the gospel witness has brought its own kind of trauma to the activity of church witness today. And in a strange way, as the Indigenous community is coming out of the failure and the trauma of the past, I think also we are dealing with that even in the acceleration of church and church growth. There is something that needs to, and I think is going on, where that confession of failure and cultural deafness needs to find resolve and ways that allow the next generation to move on that are much more sensitive to the things that we simply were insensitive to. I've been in ministry for 6 decades, and I realize that there have been moments and places and with people where I've simply failed.
Yeah. Well, we committed to be agents of reconciliation, didn't we? Remember that meeting we had in Winnipeg?
I do. I'll never forget that.
And I just think we're trying to do that best we can. And in the end, that's all you can do, I think, is to try to be honest with people. There's a phrase, Oji Cree word, it's inanamoan. It means the feelings that we have in our heart. And you got to talk about those things. You got to try to understand them.
Thank you, Ray, for joining us today and for helping us understand our shared history and what the Christian faith means to Indigenous brothers and sisters today. And thank you for being a part of the podcast. I'd be so grateful if you would subscribe and share this episode, and always use #Evangelical360. If you'd like to learn more about today's guest, be sure to check the show notes or description below. And if you haven't already received my free ebook and newsletter, please go to brianstiller.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.
Don't miss the next interview. Be sure to subscribe to Evangelical 360 on YouTube.